Welcome ladies and gents, Chris Andre here. You can find me at BetBoxing on Twitter. Of course, you can subscribe to the channel. Let's talk boxing. Let's talk about Dillian White. He was asked about Deontay Wilder and he said, I don't know what Wilder is doing. I just need to come back and I want to fight everyone I lost to and to try and avenge my losses. I'm still one of the best fighters around. Now, he was mocked for saying this. A lot of people online have been saying, what you're talking about, you're not at that level. You know, you just need to retire. You're going to get seriously hurt against Wilder. You never could have competed against these lot and so on and so forth. Some people have been less disrespectful, not calling him a joke as many have, but they're also not completely sold on Dillian White and his sort of career, the career that he's built up. Because I came out and I put out a tweet and I said, listen, for a guy who is a contender, we're not talking about a world champion, we're talking about a guy who is a contender. He's got a terrific CV, a great CV. I mean, there are champions that have won world titles and have fought lesser guys than Dillian White. There are guys that have become world champions and then did not defend against guys who were as good as the ones Dillian White beat. But there have been people that disagree and they took exception to that fact. You've got people like at Ed Loves Tech 1, shout out to Ed on Twitter. He feels that in order to judge a CV, you have to look at the opposition and consider who they fought after that individual fought them. Did they go on to have great careers? Did they go on to achieve big things afterwards? If not, then their level wasn't particularly high in the first place. Well, I have to disagree with that respectfully, because sometimes you can ruin a fighter. Okay, you have someone like Jeff Lacey, for instance. It's easy to look back at that in retrospect and say, well, actually, maybe he wasn't all that before Joe Calzaghe beat him. Maybe it's an overrated win. But at the time, they were talking about him being a mini Mike Tyson, that he was going to run through the division, that Joe Calzaghe had no chance. Well, Joe battered him to such an extent that maybe there was physical damage that he had to carry on as baggage in the future. Hatman also often speaks about the importance of confidence. Maybe his confidence was eradicated. Maybe his mentality and his approach to the sport also changes. You know, Tyson Fury would always say, if you swallow once, you'll always swallow. Now, to put that in a less crude way, the concept behind that, the philosophical concept, because it's actually quite an intellectual thing to think about, is that if you accept defeat on one occasion, you accept it mentally, you're probably going to realize that it's not the end of the world. You're not going to be ostracized. You're not going to walk down the street with everybody pointing their finger and laughing at you and making you feel like an outcast in society. So as a result, you reframe your way of thinking. It's no longer the biggest of deals to accept a defeat. You can accept a defeat and still have respect. You can still be proud. You can still make money and so on and so forth. And so it becomes easier after that to lose that edge and to accept that defeat is a possibility. You don't fear it as much. These are the things that can happen after a guy beats you. So you may not reach the heights you once were after you've lost. It doesn't necessarily mean you weren't a brilliant fighter and that it wasn't a terrific win. Paulie Malignaggi often speaks about his win against Senchenko in the Ukraine. Paulie was past his best at the time. People gave him no chance. In fact, the networks didn't even show it in the United States. They just thought he's got no chance. Senchenko's this up-and-coming monster from the Ukraine. He's going to kill him. Paulie's a non-puncher. How's he going to go and win in the Ukraine? He's not going to win a points decision over there. Paulie was so consistent with the jab, finding a home for it so well, targeting the eye. He was able to cause such bad cuts that Senchenko got schooled and stopped, and Paulie became a world champion for the second time in what was a terrific win. And after that, people started saying, well, Senchenko weren't all that because he didn't go on to have an incredible career. He beat Ricky Hatton and people were saying that Hatton was washed up, and because he then didn't go on to have a brilliant career, people undermine it. But as Paulie says, you have to look at it at the time. You have to place it in the context of the time, and that's true, I agree, for the reasons that I've explained. Unless, of course, you consider the guy to have been a hype job from the start. If you never rated a guy or you thought he was a bit overrated from the beginning, well then, if you're vindicated by him losing, that's different. You're not going to give as much credence to that win as everyone else. But when a guy's been highly rated and he's done well in his career, you have to then give credit for those victories. Now, you look at someone like Dillian White's CV, he's only got 3 defeats. And if you look at who those defeats are against, you've got Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua, elite level opposition. You've also got Alexander Povetkin. Now, Povetkin was a guy who was an amazing fighter, one of the best fighters I've seen in my lifetime, not to have won a world title. An Olympic gold medalist, he could potentially have won a world title had he not been subjected to the most biased refereeing I've ever seen in a fight. when he fought against Vladimir Klitschko. Vlad was holding this dude so much, he was practically climbing on him like a piggy bank, like a kid at a zoo, right? Climbing on him, both his feet off the floor like Superman. It was ridiculous. If you want to fight MMA, bro, go in a cage and give Povetkin the right to then try and take you down from the legs in that scenario and try and ground and pound if that's what you want to do. But that wasn't boxing. And what it did is it completely took away Povetkin's ability to fight at mid-range or on the inside. And obviously there's such a height and reach difference in the dynamic that Vlad was able to pop in from range. Vlad had no inside game. Vlad didn't like to be hit and he liked to tie up. Had Povetkin been allowed to work at mid-range and inside, he could have potentially lit up Vlad like a Christmas tree. He could have knocked him spark out. So the career of Povetkin could have taken an entirely different trajectory, but the referee, to be honest with you, was atrocious. You can go and Google it and see the level of holding we're talking about. But Povetkin was a quality fighter, make no mistake. Now, yes, he sparked Dillian White out. But as David Haye once said, or Anthony Joshua also said, you just have to go and look at the highlight reel of Povetkin. And in terms of short power, he's got some of the most incredible short power highlight reels you'll ever see. The man's an incredible puncher up close. And he managed to cap Dillian White with a beautiful setup. It was a gorgeous knockout. Now, he did avenge it in stunning fashion in the 4th round. And by then, Povetkin was washed up. So I understand how a lot of people hold this against Dillian White, that first defeat against Povetkin, but it's one of those things where it was a big shot that landed, man. Okay, it happens, right, against a monster puncher. But generally speaking, he's not lost to a lot of guys, right? He's lost to 3 dudes. And in terms of the people he beat, some of them are really good fighters. I mean, first and foremost, let's consider someone like Joseph Parker. Joseph Parker was a former world champion. There was a time when Parker was being discussed along with Anthony Joshua as who would be the future of the heavyweight division. Who's going to come out on top between these two dudes? People weren't talking about Fury back then. It was Parker or AJ. And he has won a world title. He then lost to AJ on points. And a lot of people do question the heart and the mentality of Joseph Parker. And we understand that, right? Has he got that grit? Is he too nice? And so on and so forth. Has he got a mental block? But as a talent, he's a brilliant fighter. And Dillian White was able to come through that. And he was able to win the fight. That's a great win for Dillian White. Such a good win that Joseph Parker's coming up against Joe Joyce. Joe Joyce, many people think, is potentially a future world champ. Many people felt that they wanted to see him fight Fury instead of Dillian White. A former Olympic silver medalist. Many felt he should have won gold. He stopped Daniel Dubois. People are big on Joe Joyce. And he's now fighting Joseph Parker. And it's such a competitive fight. Quite frankly, most people can't be 100% sure who's going to win that fight. Right? Because they've both got strengths and weaknesses that the other one, sort of they mesh well. They marry up well against each other. It's a terrific fight. That's how good Joseph Parker is. And you have to give a lot of credit to Dillian White for coming through that. You then, of course, also have Derek Chisora. Now, Derek Chisora, people look at it at face value and they go 32-12. That's this dude's record. How can you have lost 12 fights and be a top-level guy? But if you look at someone like BoxRec, for instance, they base their ranking systems on who you fought, and it's like a point system, who you've beaten. They give you credit for your results, not just in terms of reputation. Now, don't get me wrong. BoxRec is not infallible, right? But it gives you a rough guide, and they currently have him ranked at 8th in the world. Now, I do think that's too high. I don't believe Derek Chisora is the 8th best heavyweight in the world. But there was a time when he was in that section of the rankings. He was a legit top 10 guy. Let's consider some of these 12 defeats, shall we? He's lost, like I said, to Joseph Parker on a couple of occasions, a former world champ. Joseph Parker is certainly a top 10 guy. Probably not top 3 or 4, but somewhere between, say, 5 and 8 or 9, you could argue. He lost to him on a couple of occasions. The second time, Chisora looked completely washed up. So we're not going to judge Chisora when he fought White based on Chisora fighting Parker that second fight. The first fight, though, was a split decision that could have gone either way. He dropped Joseph Parker. I felt that Parker won the fight by a point, by a round, but it was a very, very close fight, right? It could have gone either way. So he's shown he's operated at that sort of level. He's also lost to the likes of Alexander Usyk. He lost to Tyson Fury twice. And he lost to David Haye as well. And to Vitaly Klitschko. Now, those are elite level guys. Maybe you could argue that David Haye was on the cusp of elite rather than elite. Number 1 unified cruiserweight champion. Top 3 guy at heavyweight. You'd have to say. So David Haye was a legit upper echelon guy, but maybe not quite elite, all-time great status like the others. But the others are all-time great, fantastic fighters. The sort of fighters whereby if you were another all-time great of the past, you may not have beaten them. You may be Floyd Patterson, you may be Joe Frazier, you may be whoever. You might have lost to all those guys we're talking about here. So does that mean that this deducts from Derek Chisora is a world level fighter today. He's not elite. You could argue that every time he stepped up to elite, he fell short. But it doesn't deduct who he was as a world level fighter today, right? So it's almost as though those defeats, those 2 to Fury, that 1 to Usyk, that 1 to Vitali, that 1 to Hay, it's almost like they don't count in a sense. They're such top level fighters that you're not going to hold it against him in terms of making a case for him not being a top fighter today. So you take away those 5 defeats and that 12 instantly becomes 7. You take away the 2 from Dillian White himself, because you're not going to include those as defeats, because if I beat an undefeated guy who's 30-0, you're not going to turn to me and say, well, he was 30-2. No, he was 30-0 before I beat him, and then I beat him again in a rematch. I earned those losses, so you can't count those. So those 7 now become 5. Now, from those 5 defeats, the other 2 are against, like I said, Joseph Parker, who was definitely a top-level guy. You've got Robert Helenius, who was a top 15 guy at the time, and he beat Robert Helenius. We all know that he should have got the decision against Helenius, and he didn't get it. So really, that's 4 defeats. He's then lost to Kubrat Pulev. That's a legitimate defeat. But again, Kubrat Pulev was, at the time, a top 5 guy. This is not Kubrat Pulev that fought Anthony Joshua and got completely washed. So we're seeing a pattern here against the elite guys, or the upper echelon guys, the likes of Parker, Pulev, the likes of David Hay, the top sort of 5 guys, top 6, top 7 guys. He's fallen short, but he's competitive. The only guys that he really lost to, whereby you'd have to say that's a bad defeat, man, that's got to be Ajit Kabayel, and that was a split decision. That is a disappointing defeat, though. You know, you would have expected him to come through that. That's the one you have to hold against him, even though Ajit Kabayel was undefeated at the time. We know he's been popped for steroid use. But the point is, if you look at what he's done, he should have beaten Helenius. He did beat Malik Scott, and a lot of people, again, can look back at Malik Scott and say, well, what did he go on to do? At the time he fought Malik Scott, Malik Scott had a terrific record. He was 35-0 was Malik Scott at the time, and he was considered one of the biggest prospects coming out of US boxing, and technically he's brilliant. As a mover, very rarely do you get a heavyweight that moves like Malik Scott. The problem with Scott, and I say this when I compare him to other heavyweights, not the average Joe obviously, but compared to other heavyweights, he had no heart, he had no grit, he had no determination. But up until that point, he was undefeated. It was Derek Chisora that made him potentially lose that taste for battle, because he'd built up a big lead against Del Boy, and then Del continued to pummel away at that body, right? Really going after him. This was for the vacant WBO international title, right? So these are guys that are trying to push themselves in towards I know these belts, a lot of people rubbish them, but what they do is they give you a high ranking. They put you in a position to then get a shot at someone else. So this was a big fight, and Malik Scott was considered a tough fighter, and he broke him down. Okay, he broke him down, and then after that, Malik Scott, shortly after that, was rumoured to have sparred Tyson Fury. He got his eardrums broken in that fight, and he was never the same again. So maybe the combination of fighting Del Boy and then that sparring session with Fury took away his taste for battle. But Malik Scott was a very good fighter. He also beat David Price, of course, and Carlos Takam, a guy who's probably more of a top 20 sort of guy, but was a very tough man, a guy that would always give guys a lot of problems. He knocked him out. He also destroyed Artur Szpilka in 2 rounds, who gave Deontay Wilder a real rough night. So what you're starting to see is an emerging pattern, and that pattern is that when he's fought guys that are in the top, the elite, he fell short. But he gave them all a tough fight, except Fury in that second fight, which was comfortable. He gave everyone a hard night. Then you've got the sort of top 3 to 7 region. He lost those too. But then when you start to look at him fighting the top 15 to 20 guys, he's beaten them. So he's somewhere around the peripheries of top 10. Okay, in his day, in his prime, he's probably just inside that top 10. So this is a legitimate win for Dillian White. This is a good win for Dillian White, right? You can't undermine Chisora and just look at it and say he's got 12 defeats. This is a guy who's been in there. A lot of people say it's not about the L, it's about who you fight. Well, then give respect to the guys that are taking on that mentality. Even if they're ranking up those defeats, he's been in there with everyone. Give him respect. There's no point in being undefeated when you've not fought anybody, right? He's been in there with some of the best of all time, has Derek Chisora, and the top guys of his day today. And he's always given a good account of himself, and he's beaten some very good guys, and he deserves credit. So that's a great win for Dillian White. Both of those wins are great wins. We've spoken about Povetkin, Oscar Rivas. You know, a real puncher who was undefeated at the time, 26-0. Again, you have to put it in context of the time. The Bridgerweight champion now. I know a lot of people, myself included, aren't too excited about the Bridgerweight title. If they want to legitimize it and make it a proper title, it might be a good idea to have Rivas Jennings too, because that was a terrific fight. The first one, Jennings built up a big lead. Rivas needed a knockout in the last round and he got it. So there's history there as well. That would be a terrific fight. But Rivas a real pocket rocket, and Dillian had to get off the floor. A man with an amateur pedigree as well, Rivas. He had to get off the floor to beat this man. Lucas Brown, a former heavyweight champion, a big puncher who could actually get on his toes and move a little bit. Yeah, he too was past his best by the time they fought. But nonetheless, you know, he's a man, he's a name, a former world champion, and he blew him out in 6 rounds. You got Robert Helenius again, and you've seen Helenius having somewhat of an Indian summer with the Kauznaki wins. He beat him by unanimous decision. So, you know, you look at these things and you say, look, all right, he's been in with AJ, he's been in with Fury, and he lost. He had that additional loss to Povetkin, who could have been a top-level fighter. Things didn't quite work out for him. He was in the twilight of his career. That's the one defeat you might say is a real blemish on his record. But generally speaking, when you look at Dillian White, he's done a lot in this sport. For a guy that moved over from MMA, he's managed to transition successfully with a very limited amateur pedigree. He's able to use his grit and determination, a brilliant trigger counter, a fantastic consistent jab. As I said in the preview to the last fight, he lands 7.1 jabs a round, the second most in the heavyweight division after Alexander Usyk, who's only landing 0.1 jabs more per round, right? So he's right up there with some of the most consistent jabbers in the heavyweight division and indeed the entire sport as a whole. So you have to give this guy credit. He's built a great career. Now, where does he go from here? Should he fight Wilder? Should he fight these lot? No. I agree with Hatman that he should retire. His punch resistance isn't what it once was. And not only that, you have to consider where he would have to go in terms of absorbing punishment to get another world title shot. Well, Dan at DJK Box 101, suggests that he should actually, what will probably happen is that Anthony Joshua may lose to Alexander Usyk in the rematch and that he would end up fighting Anthony Joshua next. Well, let's just say for argument's sake that was to happen. If he was to fight Anthony Joshua and he was somehow to win that fight, the undisputed title fight would then happen between Usyk and Tyson Fury. Let's say for argument's sake that Tyson Fury was to win that fight. He then vacates the belt. If White was to beat Anthony Joshua, he could potentially face Alexander Usyk for the vacant belt, right? Or potentially he faces the winner of Joe Joyce and Parker. Let's just say for argument's sake it's Joe Joyce. I want you to start to think about the potential punishment he's going to have to take in those 2 fights, even if he wins them both, to then get another title shot. Do you see what I'm saying? To get his title shot, he'd have to beat AJ, then fight for a vacant belt and come through that, win that fight, and he's a champ. But think about the damage he takes during those 2 fights. When the guy's already showing signs of decline in terms of punch resistance, it's not worth it, man. The man's made a lot of money. And like I hope I've pointed to here, I believe he's built a brilliant legacy. He's been one of the top contenders of the day. He's done brilliantly well for British boxing and for himself. And he's made an awful lot of money. There's nothing left to prove, except for, of course, that dream of being a world champ. But the price to pay, the health to pay is far too great. But that's my take on it. I am defending Dillian White from all the criticism. I think he's been a terrific fighter. Let me know what you think and what you want to see Dillian White do from this point forth. And how do you rate Dillian White as a fighter and how do you rate his career? Thanks for watching, everyone. Chat to you soon. Take care. God bless.